The first time my neighbor ran over my trash can, I thought it was an accident. The 57th time, I realized it was a pattern. The sound came at exactly 6:15 every Tuesday morning, sharp and ugly, like someone snapping a thick plastic chair in half. Crack. Then the low growl of a $60,000 Escalade idling for a second before rolling calmly down the street as if nothing had happened. I would step out onto my driveway with my coffee still warm in my hand and find the same scene waiting for me. Black plastic shattered across the concrete, coffee grounds and cereal boxes scattered across the curb like confetti after a parade nobody asked for. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 45 years old, an electrician by trade, and I live on a quiet corner lot in a place called Pinewood Gardens, one of those tidy suburban neighborhoods where every mailbox matches and every lawn is supposed to be 2.5 inches tall. I bought this house 3 years ago after my divorce. Nothing fancy, just a small place with a decent garage where I could keep my tools and give my 2 kids a stable place to stay when they visit on weekends. I didn't move here looking for trouble. I moved here because the street looked peaceful and the neighbors waved when you drove by. That was before Brenda Whitmore decided my trash can was apparently the greatest threat to community order anyone had ever seen. Brenda is 52, drives a pearl white Escalade that shines like it gets polished more often than most people wash their dishes, and she carries herself like the unofficial sheriff of Pinewood Gardens. Officially, she calls herself the neighborhood compliance officer, though I later learned that title doesn't actually exist anywhere in the HOA paperwork. Unofficially, she's the person who knocks on doors about mailbox paint colors, measures grass with a metal ruler, and leaves typed violation notices in people's mailboxes like little paper warnings from suburban royalty. The problem with my house is simple geography. Being on the corner means the city requires my trash bin to sit right near the curb so the garbage truck can reach it without blocking traffic. The city ordinance says within 3 feet of the curb, and I follow that rule exactly because electricians get used to following codes. Brenda, however, seems to believe the curb belongs personally to her SUV. The first time she crushed the bin, she leaned out the window with that polite smile people use when they're pretending to be innocent and said, "Oh dear, these streets are just so narrow." I replaced the can that afternoon. $23 at the hardware store. The next Tuesday morning, at 6:15 sharp, the sound came again. Crack. By the 4th broken bin, I started noticing something interesting. The street is actually wide enough for 2 pickup trucks to pass each other comfortably. There was plenty of space. Brenda just chose not to use it. And every time I walked outside to pick up the pieces, she drove away slowly, like someone leaving a scene they didn't expect anyone to question. My daughter Emma watched it happen once through the front window while she was visiting for the weekend. She looked at me and asked a simple question that stuck in my head longer than the sound of breaking plastic. "Dad, why does she keep doing that?" I didn't have an answer then, but I did have a growing suspicion. Because people like Brenda don't expect their neighbors to fight back. They expect them to keep buying new trash cans. The thing about routine is that once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 6:15, the same engine rumble rolled past my bedroom window, low and expensive sounding, like a luxury SUV clearing its throat before work. Then came the sound that had become strangely familiar over the past 2 months. A quick plastic crack, sometimes a dull thump, then silence. When I stepped outside that morning, the air still carried the smell of diesel from the garbage truck that had passed 10 minutes earlier, and my latest trash can lay on its side again with one wool bent sideways like a shopping cart. Coffee filters and cereal boxes had spilled across the curb, fluttering slightly in the early autumn breeze. I stood there in my driveway holding a half-warm mug and just stared at it for a long moment, because at that point the situation had crossed the line from annoying into something almost impressive. It takes commitment to destroy that many trash cans. Inside the house, I could hear the faint clatter of dishes as my son Tyler searched for a bowl. In the kitchen, he was 15 and still moved through mornings like a half-awake raccoon. When he stepped onto the porch and saw the mess, he just shook his head slowly. "Again?" he asked. I nodded once and bent down to pick up the broken lid. The plastic edge felt rough against my fingers. "Again," I said. Tyler leaned against the railing, watching me collect scattered trash with the tired patience of someone who had already decided the situation was ridiculous. "You know she does it on purpose, right?" he said. I had known that for a while, but hearing it out loud made something settle in my chest. Because he was right. Accidents happen once or twice. 57 times is a decision. Later that afternoon, I drove to the hardware store again. The same place where the cashier had started greeting me with the sympathetic smile people give when they recognize a regular problem. The smell of fresh-cut lumber and fertilizer hung in the air as I walked down the aisle toward the trash bins. Rows of identical black containers stood there like quiet witnesses. $23 each. I had bought enough of them over the past 2 months to start memorizing the barcode. The cashier scanned the bin and looked up at me. "Let me guess," he said. "Corner house on Pinewood Drive?" I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged. "Lady in the white Escalade comes in here, sometimes complaining about trash cans blocking the road." That confirmed what I already suspected. This was not just careless driving. This was a hobby. On the drive home, the late afternoon sun bounced off windshields, and the quiet suburban street looked as peaceful as it always did. Trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes stretching down the block like something from a real estate brochure. But as I pulled into my driveway, I started noticing details I had ignored before. The exact angle where the curb met the asphalt. The tire marks that appeared every Tuesday morning. The way the street curved just enough that someone would have to deliberately steer toward the curb to hit that exact spot. Electricians spend years learning to notice small patterns in wires and circuits. Problems reveal themselves through repetition. By the time I set the new bin beside the curb that evening, something had shifted in my thinking. Because this was no longer about replacing trash cans. This was about understanding the pattern. By Monday evening, the new trash bin stood beside the curb exactly where the city ordinance required it, 3 feet from the edge of the asphalt, wheels facing the street the same way every sanitation truck driver in America expects them. The plastic still smelled faintly new, that chemical scent that reminds you it just came off a factory line somewhere far away. I stood on the porch for a moment looking down the quiet stretch of Pinewood Drive while the sun slipped lower behind the houses. Sprinklers ticked on one lawn at a time up the block, the soft rhythmic hiss mixing with the distant bark of someone's golden retriever. From the outside, our neighborhood looked like a postcard version of suburban life. But the longer I stood there, the more I noticed something else. Across the street, a pair of curtains shifted slightly. Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down paused while walking her small terrier and glanced at the bin like she already knew what would happen next. People had been watching this little Tuesday morning ritual for weeks. The difference was nobody said anything about it out loud. That changed the next afternoon when I was tightening the lug nuts on my work van and a shadow fell across the driveway. I looked up and saw Brenda Whitmore standing there with the same polite smile she always wore when she wanted something. Up close, she smelled faintly of expensive perfume and freshly brewed coffee, the kind that probably costs more per bag than my entire grocery bill for the week. Her white Escalade sat parked neatly along the curb behind her, spotless enough to reflect the sunlight like a mirror. She folded her arms slowly and looked at the trash bin beside the curb as if examining a suspicious object. "Daniel," she said in that calm voice people use when they want to sound helpful, "I noticed your trash receptacle is sitting a little close to the roadway again." I wiped my hands on a shop rag and followed her gaze even though I already knew the measurement by heart. 3 feet from the curb. Exactly what the city sanitation department required. "City ordinance says it has to be there for collection," I replied. Her smile tightened slightly, just enough to show the gears turning behind. Well, she said, drawing the word out carefully. "This community also has standards about maintaining safe traffic flow. Large containers near corners can create hazards." I leaned against the van door and looked down the wide, empty street. There was enough space for 2 pickup trucks and a school bus to pass each other comfortably. The only hazard out there was the white Escalade idling behind her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A warm breeze carried the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block and rustled the maple leaves along the sidewalk. Finally, she nodded toward the bin again. "It would be unfortunate if something happened to it," she said softly. Then she turned, heels clicking lightly against the pavement as she walked back to her SUV. The engine started with a smooth hum, and the vehicle rolled away slowly toward the end of the street. I watched the reflection of sunlight fade off the rear window until the corner swallowed the view. Then I looked back at the trash bin standing quietly beside the curb. Tyler stepped onto the porch behind me with a soda in his hand and followed my line of sight. "Let me guess," he said. "She complained again." I nodded once. The pattern was no longer subtle. This was no accident. This was a warning. Tuesday morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm our street always had. The pale light of early sunrise stretching across the driveways while sprinklers ticked and hissed across trimmed lawns. I woke up a few minutes before 6, not because of an alarm, but because my brain had started anticipating the sound. After enough weeks, your mind learns the schedule of a problem the same way it learns the rhythm of a train passing nearby. I stepped into the kitchen and poured coffee while the house stayed mostly quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Outside the front window, the trash bin stood exactly where I had placed it the night before, square to the curb, wheels forward, lid closed tight. It looked perfectly normal sitting there beside the edge of the road, like every other trash bin in every other neighborhood across the country. But now I could not look at it without thinking about the pattern. 6:15. That was the time. Not 6:10. Not 6:20. Exactly 6:15. Every Tuesday. At 6:14, I stepped out onto the porch and leaned lightly against the railing. The air carried that cool early morning smell of damp grass and distant coffee brewing inside nearby houses. A blue jay chirped somewhere in the maple tree across the street. Everything felt calm and ordinary. Then right on schedule I heard it. The low engine rumble rolled around the corner before the vehicle itself appeared, smooth and steady like a clock starting its shift. The white Escalade turned onto Pinewood Drive and glided toward the corner where my driveway met the street. I watched the headlights sweep briefly across the pavement before the vehicle approached the trash bin. There was plenty of space in the road. More than enough for a careful driver to pass by without touching anything. But the SUV drifted slowly closer to the curb. The driver's side window was down just enough that I could see Brenda Whitmore's face turned forward with that same neutral expression she always wore when she pretended nothing unusual was happening. The front tire rolled closer and closer to the curb. Then the sound came again. Crack. The bin tipped sideways and slid a few inches along the pavement before coming to rest on its side. The Escalade continued forward another 20 feet before slowing. For a second the brake lights glowed red against the asphalt. Then the vehicle pulled away and disappeared down the street toward the main road like it had simply completed another ordinary morning drive. I stood there listening to the quiet return to the neighborhood. No dramatic scene. No shouting. Just the faint rustle of trash bags shifting inside the bin where it lay on the pavement. Tyler stepped out behind me, still wearing a hoodie and squinting at the morning light. He looked from me to the bin and back again. She did it again, he said flatly. I nodded slowly. I walked down the driveway and lifted the bin upright, brushing a few loose scraps of paper from the curb. The lid had another crack along the hinge. The plastic would probably hold together for another week or two before it split completely. I ran my hand along the side of the container and thought about what Brenda had said the day before. It would be unfortunate if something happened to it. The breeze carried the faint smell of diesel from the sanitation truck somewhere down the block. As I set the bin back into position, I noticed the faint tire mark along the edge of the curb again, the same curved line I had seen every week for 2 months. Electricians learn to read patterns in wires and circuits. And once you recognize the pattern, the next step is figuring out how to break it. That afternoon, I started doing what electricians always do when something stops making sense. We investigate the system. The sun was still high when I pulled a folding chair into the garage and opened my laptop on the workbench beside a pile of wire cutters and screwdrivers. The faint smell of motor oil mixed with the dusty scent of cardboard boxes while a small fan hummed in the corner, pushing warm air around the room. Tyler sat nearby scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing toward the street like he expected the Escalade to appear again just to prove a point. I typed slowly into the search bar, pulling up the exact wording of the city sanitation code. Section 12.4.3, Residential Waste Placement. Containers must be placed within 3 feet of the curb on collection day. That part one already knew. What interested me more was the line further down. Municipal waste placement is governed by city code and not subject to homeowners association enforcement outside of property boundaries. In other words, the spot where the trash bin sat was technically public right-of-way. The HOA could complain about lawn height and mailbox paint all they wanted, but the curb belonged to the city. I leaned back in the chair and looked out through the open garage door toward the corner where the bin had been knocked over that morning. Tyler noticed my expression change. You found something, did you not? He asked. I nodded slowly. Your trash bin is exactly where the law says it should be, he said, reading the screen upside down from across the workbench. I tapped the line with my finger. Exactly, I said, which means the problem is not the bin. Tyler glanced toward the street again and then back at me. The problem is her. The quiet certainty in his voice made me smile slightly. For weeks I had been treating the situation like a minor neighborhood irritation, the kind of thing people tolerate, because arguing feels like more trouble than it is worth. But now that I understood the pattern and the rule behind it, something shifted in the way I looked at the entire situation. People like Brenda Whitmore rely on two things: silence and inconvenience. They expect everyone else to get tired before they do. They expect neighbors to shrug, buy another trash bin, and move on with their day. But electricians spend their entire careers solving problems that hide inside walls and ceilings. When a circuit fails, you do not replace the light bulb 57 times. You trace the line until you find the fault. I closed the laptop and stood up, brushing a layer of sawdust from the workbench. The garage door creaked softly as a breeze moved through it, carrying the smell of someone grilling burgers somewhere down the block. Pinewood Drive looked peaceful as always, the same quiet street with the same trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes. But now when I looked at the curb beside my driveway, I did not see a trash bin anymore. I saw a point on a map where the same event happened every Tuesday morning at exactly 6:15. Tyler watched me thinking for a moment before asking the obvious question. So what are you going to do? I walked over to the corner of the garage where an old measuring tape hung on a nail beside a stack of scrap lumber from a fence repair project. I pulled the tape free and stretched it across the concrete floor with a soft metallic click. First, I said calmly, I am going to measure a few things. I started measuring that same evening while the sun dipped low behind the houses on Pinewood Drive and long shadows stretched across the pavement. The metal tape measure clicked and rattled softly as it rolled out across the driveway. 8 feet from the garage edge to the curb. 3 feet from the curb to the exact spot where the trash bin always sat on collection day. I measured it twice because electricians trust numbers more than guesses. Tyler watched from the porch railing, sipping a soda while the evening air carried the faint smell of barbecue drifting from somewhere farther down the street. A lawn mower hummed in the distance, and the soft chirp of crickets had already begun creeping into the quiet spaces. Between sounds, everything about the neighborhood looked calm and ordinary, which made the situation feel even stranger when you thought about it. 57 damaged trash bins in a street that otherwise looked like it belonged on a real estate postcard. After confirming the distance from the curb, I walked along the edge of the road and crouched down near the spot where the tire marks curved toward the pavement. The faint arc was still there from that morning, a darker stripe against the asphalt where the Escalade's tire had brushed the edge before tipping the bin. I ran a finger lightly along the line and followed it forward several feet. The angle told the whole story. Brenda did not drift toward the curb by accident. She turned the wheel deliberately every time she reached the corner. Tyler stepped down from the porch and walked over beside me, hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. You are mapping it out like a crime scene, he said quietly. I smiled slightly and stood up, brushing a little dust from my jeans. Not a crime scene, I said. A pattern. We walked back toward the garage where my workbench sat cluttered with tools from years of electrical work. Extension cords hung on hooks along the wall beside shelves filled with spare parts, junction boxes, and rolls of copper wire. The overhead light buzzed faintly when I flipped the switch, casting a steady glow across the bench. I pulled a notepad closer and sketched a simple diagram of the corner of the street. Driveway, curb, placement point for the trash bin. Then I added the curved line where the tire always traveled. The drawing looked simple, almost childish, but it represented weeks of observation. Tyler leaned over the bench and studied it. She always turns the same way, he said. I nodded and tapped the paper with the tip of a pencil, which means she expects the same result every time. He glanced back toward the open garage door where the street lay quiet under the fading orange sky. So what happens if the result changes? He asked. I set the pencil down and looked at the diagram for a moment. The soft hum of the garage light filled the silence while the evening breeze rustled the leaves outside. Electricians learn something important during their first year on the job. Circuits repeat the same behavior until something in the system changes. If you change the right component, the entire pattern shifts. I folded the measuring tape, and placed it on the workbench beside the sketch. Then I looked back toward the curb where the trash bin would sit again next Tuesday morning. Then the pattern ends, I said calmly. I began building the solution on Wednesday evening after work, when the neighborhood had settled into its usual calm routine and the sky over Pinewood Drive turned the soft orange color that always comes just before sunset. The garage smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, while the overhead light cast a steady glow across my workbench. Tyler sat on an upside-down bucket nearby, watching with the quiet curiosity of someone who knew something interesting was happening but had not yet figured out the details. I rolled the old trash bin into the middle of the garage and examined the cracked hinge again. The plastic had been weakened so many times it barely held together now, which meant it had already served its purpose as a witness to the pattern. I pulled a fresh container from the back of the garage, one I had picked up earlier that afternoon from the hardware store. It looked exactly like every other residential trash bin in the neighborhood. Black plastic, hinged lid, 2 small wheels on the back. Completely ordinary to anyone driving past at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning. That was important. The outside of the system needed to look exactly the same as before. Electricians understand that most problems hide behind appearances. Tyler leaned forward slightly and tilted his head while I placed the bin on the workbench. It looks normal, he said. That is the idea, I replied. I opened a drawer beneath the bench and removed a few pieces of scrap material from an old fence project. A short length of treated lumber, a pair of steel brackets, several heavy bolts that had once held a gate hinge in place. None of it looked remarkable by itself, but together it formed the kind of quiet reinforcement you rarely notice until pressure meets resistance. The metallic clink of tools echoed lightly around the garage as I worked, measuring carefully before attaching the supports along the inner frame where the plastic walls were strongest. The reinforcement stayed hidden beneath the lid line, where nobody driving past would ever see it. Tyler walked around the bench slowly while I tightened the final bolt with a ratchet wrench. The sound of metal clicking into place felt oddly satisfying, the way finishing a small mechanical puzzle always does. Outside the open garage door, the street remained peaceful, a neighbor watering their garden, while the faint smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the evening air. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested anything unusual was happening inside the garage at that moment. When I finally stepped back and wiped my hands on a shop rag, the bin looked exactly the same as the one it replaced. Same shape, same color, same quiet presence beside the curb. Tyler crouched beside it and knocked lightly against the side with his knuckles. Instead of the hollow plastic sound we were used to hearing, the reinforced structure produced a dull, solid thud. His eyebrows lifted slowly. "That is different," he said. I nodded and rolled the container toward the garage door where the fading sunlight spilled across the concrete floor. Next Tuesday morning, the bin would sit in the same place it always had, 3 feet from the curb, exactly where the city required it. The pattern would appear unchanged to anyone driving down Pinewood Drive at 6:15. But inside the system, one small component had been adjusted. Tuesday morning arrived quietly again, the way it always did on Pinewood Drive. The sky was still pale blue when I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee warming my hands. The reinforced trash bin stood beside the curb exactly where it belonged, 3 feet from the edge of the pavement, just like the city ordinance required. From the outside, it looked identical to every other container on the street. Black plastic, hinged lid, 2 small wheels. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual. Tyler leaned against the porch railing beside me, still half awake, but curious enough to watch what would happen. The neighborhood moved through its normal early routine. A sprinkler clicked on 2 houses down. Somewhere in the distance, a garage door opened with a mechanical hum. The air smelled faintly of wet grass and fresh coffee drifting from kitchen windows. Everything felt calm and predictable. Then the familiar sound arrived right on schedule. The low engine rumble turned the corner onto Pinewood Drive, smooth and steady like a train running along a track it had traveled many times before. The white Escalade rolled into view beneath the early sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the quiet houses as it approached the corner of my driveway. I watched the vehicle glide closer, the tires humming softly against the pavement. There was still plenty of room in the street for the driver to pass safely. More than enough space to leave the bin untouched. But the pattern had been repeating for weeks. The front tire drifted gradually toward the curb again, following the same curved path I had traced in the driveway with a pencil only a few nights earlier. Tyler straightened slightly beside me. Neither of us spoke. The Escalade continued forward at a steady pace until the tire reached the exact spot where the trash bin stood waiting. For a split second, everything looked exactly like every Tuesday morning before it. Then the contact came. Instead of the hollow plastic crack we had heard so many times before, the sound that followed was deeper and sharper, a solid thud that echoed briefly against the quiet houses along the street. The bin did not collapse or tip the way it always had. It held its position beside the curb, barely shifting as the vehicle rolled past it. The Escalade slowed almost immediately. The brake lights glowed bright red against the pavement as the vehicle came to a complete stop about 30 feet down the street. For a moment, the engine idled there quietly while the neighborhood remained completely still. A few seconds later, the driver door opened and Brenda Whitmore stepped out onto the pavement, looking back toward the corner of my driveway with a puzzled expression. From the porch, I watched her walk slowly toward the curb where the trash bin stood exactly where I had placed it. She circled the container once, examining it like someone trying to understand a puzzle that had suddenly stopped behaving the way it always had before. Tyler folded his arms and whispered quietly beside me. That was different. I nodded calmly and took another sip of coffee while Brenda stood there beside the curb staring at the bin that refused to behave the way she expected. The pattern had finally changed. Brenda Whitmore stood beside the curb staring at the trash bin for a long moment like it had personally betrayed her. The morning sun had climbed just high enough to cast a pale glow across the street, reflecting softly off the polished side of her white Escalade parked 30 feet away. Pinewood Drive remained quiet except for the distant rumble of the sanitation truck working its way slowly through the neighborhood. Tyler and I watched from the porch without saying anything while Brenda walked around the bin again, examining the lid, the wheels, and the side panels like she expected to find some obvious explanation written on the plastic. From the outside, it still looked exactly like every other trash container in the neighborhood. Black plastic. Hinged lid. Nothing unusual at all. After a few seconds, she placed both hands on the sides of the bin and tried to tip it slightly the way the vehicle had done every Tuesday morning for nearly 2 months. The container barely moved. The reinforced frame inside kept the structure steady, anchored firmly against the curb. She stepped back and glanced toward her SUV, then toward my porch where she finally noticed Tyler and me standing quietly with coffee cups in our hands. For a brief moment, her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to realization. She understood the pattern had changed. I raised my mug slightly in a polite morning gesture and said calmly, "Good morning, Brenda." She straightened her posture and smoothed the front of her jacket as if trying to regain control of the moment. "Your trash container seems unusually sturdy," she said after a second. Her voice carried across the quiet street with the careful tone of someone choosing words very precisely. I nodded once. "It is built to handle normal city conditions," I replied. Tyler tried to hide a grin beside me while Brenda looked back toward the bin one more time before turning slowly toward her Escalade. The engine started again with a low hum and the vehicle rolled away down the street, this time staying well clear of the curb. The sanitation truck arrived a few minutes later, the driver lifting the bin smoothly with the hydraulic arm and emptying it the way he probably had 1,000 times before. The container returned to the curb without a scratch. Over the next few weeks, the Tuesday morning routine on Pinewood Drive quietly changed. The Escalade still passed through the neighborhood at 6:15 like clockwork, but it stayed neatly centered in the lane now. The tire marks along the curb faded away as new traffic patterns replaced the old one. No more cracked plastic lids. No more scattered trash across the driveway. Just the quiet rhythm of a normal neighborhood morning. One evening about a month later, Mrs. Alvarez walked her small terrier past my driveway and paused beside the curb. She tapped the side of the bin lightly with her knuckle and raised an eyebrow. "That one looks stronger than the others," she said. I smiled slightly and nodded toward the street where the quiet suburban traffic moved along its ordinary path. "Sometimes," I said calmly, "all it takes to stop a problem is changing one small part of the system."